Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Vamos a comenzar con con la primera jornada de este ciclo de Arte de Cámara, con la presencia de Steven Cairns, que va a hablar sobre la obra de David Lamelas. El sábado tuvimos una proyección de un film de David Lamelas. Hoy vamos a tener también unas proyecciones por la tarde, y ahora vamos a disfrutar de una conferencia sobre la obra de David para contextualizarla y entender un poco cómo ha sido su evolución artística a lo largo de tantos años. El ciclo esta jornada de hoy pertenece a un ciclo que vamos a hacer mensualmente, y en el caso del ciclo de hoy agradecemos la presencia de Steven Cairns, agradecemos al British Council que hizo posible que estuviera aquí, y Francisco Lemus, que es mi compañero en la curaduría y organización de este proyecto, les va a contar un poquitito más sobre el resto de las actividades.
Muchas gracias, Rodrigo. Rodrigo Alonso, para los que están conectados a través de la web. Este es un ciclo que surgió a partir de una invitación de la Fundación Proa para pensar esos límites, esas porosidades que se suceden entre las artes, entre las diferentes artes, con el cine, con el audiovisual, con el video. Es por eso que junto a Rodrigo pensamos un ciclo que va a ser un ciclo mensual con un fuerte input académico, donde la idea es que grandes especialistas, curadores, puedan generar una primera disertación sobre un artista argentino o latinoamericano. Posteriormente, en este formato va a haber una proyección siempre de películas, de videos seleccionados, y como última y tercera instancia de esta jornada, que la vamos a ir replicando a lo largo del año, una entrevista pública entre el artista y el especialista, que en este caso nos va a acompañar David Lamelas, que vendrá a partir de las 14 y dialogará junto a Steven Cairns, con el que tiene una gran relación profesional de larga data, ya que Steven es uno de los especialistas en los films de David Lamelas. El próximo encuentro de Arte de Cámara tendrá como protagonista a Marco Scotini. Marco Scotini va a realizar una exhibición de archivo de la desobediencia en Fundación Proa, en Proa 21, mejor dicho. Así que será un gran honor contar con su mirada y también ver los films que eligió para nuestro ciclo Arte de Cámara. Gracias a todos por venir y, bueno, es un honor darle comienzo a la conferencia a Steven, que Steven es, como bien saben, jefe de programación artística del Instituto de Arte Contemporáneo de Londres.
Gracias.
1, 2, we're on, okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure to be speaking as part of this program dedicated to the work of David Lamelas, and an even greater privilege to be doing so in Buenos Aires, a city that's played such a foundational role in his artistic trajectory. David Lamelas occupies a singular position in the history of conceptual art and experimental film. Across a career that spans more than 5 decades, he's consistently redefined the terms of artistic inquiry, working at the intersection of sculpture, performance, and film. From his early experiments in spatial perception to his sustained interrogations of time, language, and representation, Lamelas has developed a practice that is rigorous, inquisitive, and remarkably prescient. He remains today an artist of enduring relevance, not only because he continues to produce new work, but because the questions he asks are no less urgent now than they were in the preceding decades. My own relationship with David's work is both professional and personal. In 2016, I curated a comprehensive retrospective of his films at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. This project afforded me the opportunity to spend considerable time speaking to David about his practice, his travels, his many collaborations and projects, but also about how he views the evolving conditions of art. These conversations have stayed with me. They revealed not only the depth of thought behind each of his works, but also the sense of humour, intellectual curiosity and emotional attentiveness that shape his practice. More recently, during the pandemic, I joined one of his time performances online on New Year's Eve 2020. This was a participatory piece where time was passed between participants around the world, 1 minute at a time, one voice at a time. A simple gesture, but one that captured so much about David's approach. The abstraction of time made tangible through language and shared experience. The lecture I'll deliver today is not a chronological survey, but rather a thematic introduction to 3 recurring ideas that animate Lamelas' work: time, place, and film form. These themes are not categorized in isolation. They are interrelated modes of inquiry that run through his practice in overlapping and recursive ways. Each of them provides a lens through which to better understand not only the films we will be watching later, but also the conceptual structure that underpins Lamelas' broader body of work. Over the next hour, I'll discuss how Lamelas explores time not as a linear measured duration, but as a perceptual condition that frames experience. I'll consider how place functions in his work, not just as a location or setting, but as a site of cultural, political, and personal resonance. And I'll look at how he uses film as a medium of critical inquiry, disseminating its conventions to reveal the assumptions embedded in the way stories are told and meanings constructed. The film selected for the program we'll see later today reflects these themes in different ways. We began with This Is My Place from 2023, his most recent film, which we watched on Saturday. Biographical film structured around conversations and memories. Today's screening includes a study of relationship between inner and outer space from 1969, Time as Activity Düsseldorf from 1969, extracts from Light at the Edge of a Nightmare made between 2002-2005, Smart People from 1991, and also The Dictator from 1976. Works that span several decades and modes of filmmaking. I'll also be showing a short excerpt of The Desert People during this lecture, so not the whole film, but just a small excerpt. Rather than providing a closed reading of each work, my intention is to offer a conceptual framework through which we might engage with them. In doing so, I hope to open a space for reflection on how we think about time, how we move through places, and how media shapes our understanding of both. To understand David Lamelas' development as an artist, we must begin in 1960s Buenos Aires, a city at once cosmopolitan and politically volatile, where experimental art and authoritarianism existed in uneasy proximity. Lamelas emerged from the dynamic scene orbiting the Istituto Torquato di Tella, apologies, as you know, a cultural institution that played a central role in promoting avant-garde practice in Latin America. The Di Tella was at the forefront of new artistic currents in kinetic art, installation, media, and conceptualism. It brought together a generation of artists who engaged critically with the language of modernity while responding to increasing repressive political conditions. Lamelas' early works were sculptural in nature, but even then they displayed a preoccupation with spatial dynamics, perceptual conditions, and the structures that shape visibility. In Limits of a Projection 1 from 1967, which we see here, a spotlight aimed at the floor in an otherwise darkened room produces a sharp, defined cone of light, both immaterial and forcefully directive. The circular projection carves out a void of visibility, transforming light itself into a sculptural form. Its counterpart, Limits of a Projection 2, extends this logic by projecting the same beam onto a surface made of 4 identical acrylic panels arranged corner to corner. In both cases, light and space operate as constitutive media. What we are shown is not an object, but a condition of seeing. That same year, 1967, in a situation of time presented also at Ditella, Lamelas installed 17 television sets tuned to blank channels, emitting only light and static. The work disengaged the devices from their communicative function, rendering them sculptural instruments of pure temporality. These early installations already show his interest in structures, systems, and the role of the spectator, concerns that would carry directly into his later filmic and conceptual work. This spatial and conceptual rigor quickly moved towards more explicitly political grounds. Lamelas' most significant breakthrough came with his participation in the 1968 Venice Biennale, where he presented Office of Information about the Vietnam War at 3 levels: the visual language, text, and audio, an installation that marked his departure from Argentina and the beginning of his European career. The work simulated an administrative office setting using Olivetti furniture and a functioning telex machine connected to the Italian news agency ANSA. As news reports on the Vietnam War were received, they were read aloud intermittently by an attendant in Italian, French, and Spanish. When not read live, recordings could be heard through headsets. Unlike conventional reportage or archival displays, Office presented news as it arrived, a conceptual intervention that transformed the gallery into a site of real-time information processing. The work offered no editorial framing, only the infrastructure of transmission. Its strength lay in its restraint. Lamelas made no attempt to shape the viewer's opinion, instead offering a system through which the viewer could confront the abstraction of war and the bureaucratic aesthetic of communication. It mirrored the paradox of an increasingly connected world experienced at a distance, where the flow of information increases but meaning becomes more elusive. Office of Information constitutes a contribution to the understanding of media and perception, not just that it echoes ideas elsewhere. Lamelas was formulating these insights through art as art, and often in advance of institutional theory's mainstream articulation. Importantly, the piece also reflects the urgency of its political moment. In 1966, Argentina had undergone a military coup that ushered in a new period of censorship, surveillance, and repression. Artists were increasingly aware of their complicity within the systems of power and representation, and many, including Lamelas, began to withdraw from object making altogether, moving instead towards immaterial practices such as language, documentation, and time-based work. Office of Information was not only a milestone in conceptual art, but also a powerful articulation of dissent. From the Biennale, Lamelas was awarded a British Council Fellowship and relocated to London, where he enrolled at Central St Martin's School of Art. This move was pivotal. London in the late 60s was a crucible of conceptualism and minimalism, and St Martin's, home of artists such as Richard Long, Gilbert and George, and Barry Flanagan, was at the heart of these developments. The city offered a different kind of political and artistic context. Less overtly repressive, but more entrenched in institutional frameworks that Lamelas soon began to question. In London, Lamelas began to shift his attention towards film, not as a vehicle for narrative cinema, but as a conceptual medium that could interrogate time, perception, and the conditions of exhibition itself. One of the earliest and most significant results of this shift, a study of relationships between inner and outer space from 1969, was commissioned for an exhibition at Camden Arts Centre. This film we will see later in today's programme. So the film begins with extended shots of the Camden exhibition space, its architecture, angles, corners and surfaces. It gradually expands outwards to the surrounding urban area, introducing ambient footage of London streets, passers-by, and finally interviews with local residents about the recent moon landing. The transition from interior to exterior is not merely geographical, it's conceptual. The inner space of the gallery is positioned in relation to the outer space of social discourse, public opinion, and mass media. The moon landing, a collective event shaped entirely through mediation, becomes a case study for Lamelas. The film poses a question, a quiet yet profound question. How does the structure of space influence what we see, what we think, and what we believe? How do built environments and media environments shape our perception? This concern with media construction and cultural framing would carry forward through Lamelas' career. What's remarkable about a study of the relationship between inner and outer space is how it folds together multiple registers: documentation, minimalism, sociological interview, and conceptual displacement. The viewer is never simply watching, they're being asked to consider how film structure mirrors the structures of meaning-making in the world. In Paris, where he spent significant time in 1968, Lamelas' work became increasingly concerned with the relationship between language, narrative, and intellectual representation. A key work from this period is Interview with Marguerite Duras. So this work was made in 1970. It uses film, photography, and text to critically explore how public figures, particularly intellectuals, are constructed and mediated. Framed as a documentary interview between Duras and Argentine writer Raúl Iscari, the film at first appears conventional, but its formal structure destabilizes the premise. The film is accompanied by a series of black and white photographs and typewritten texts extracted from the interview, each placed alongside a still image captured during the conversation. This is what we see here on the left. The effect is deliberate fragmentation of narrative coherence, a method that mirrors Duras' own explorations of the limits of language in fiction. Rather than capturing a unified portrait, the work deconstructs the authority of the interview format, asking us to reflect on how meaning shifts between voice, image, and text. Duras speaks of her novel Destroy, she said, and the character Stein, who was the emptiness, revealing an interest in absence and instability of narrative tools. Lamelas accentuates this by interrupting the visual flow, forcing us to read the gaps between what is said and what is known. The result is not a portrait of Duras, but a mediation on the ethics of and politics of representation itself. Other works from this period, such as Reading Film from Knots by R.D. Laing from 1970, also explore the relationship between text, voice, and moving image, influenced in part by the intellectual milieu of the French structuralists and psychoanalysis. These pieces anticipated later concerns with fragmentation, self-reference, and the instability of language. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Lamelas began to embrace looser, more narrative-based approaches to film. The city's relationship with cinema as both an industry and an ideology offered fertile ground for exploring the tensions between performance and authenticity. It's here that works like The Desert People from 1974 and The Dictator from 1976 would take shape, using fiction as a strategy to interrogate truth and power. But even as Lamelas adapted these different contexts, certain concerns remain consistent: the role of media, the construction of narrative, and the experience of displacement. His works move fluidly across formats and geographies, yet it's always structured by a desire to understand how systems, whether architectural, linguistic, or cinematic, condition our reality. As we move to the next section of this presentation, I want to underscore one final point. Lamelas is not a didactic artist. His work rarely provides answers. Instead, it creates spaces in which questions can be asked and asked again. The viewer is not given a conclusion, but invited into a process of watching, thinking, pausing, and returning. That openness is part of what makes his practice so generative and so enduring. Time for Lamelas is not simply a backdrop to experience. It is an active medium, a material to be sculpted and interrogated. His engagement with time not only begins not with the moving image, but with his early sculptural installations here in Buenos Aires, where duration was embedded in the viewer's experience of space. Take Situation of Four Spaces, for instance, which we see here in the image. The work comprised 4 architectural enclosures that viewers navigated physically. Each space, subtly different in size and orientation, manipulated the viewer's sense of time through the pacing of their movement. The installation didn't contain narrative, but it created an unfolding sequence, an awareness of the body moving through form, and form shaping perception over time. From the outset, Lamelas was exploring time phenomenologically, as something felt and constructive, not passively experienced. This awareness would later be formalized and expanded through his work in film and performance. In a study of a relationship between inner and outer space, which we discussed earlier, Lamelas offered a cinematic articulation of temporal experience. Time here is not universal or absolute. It's contingent, shaped by architecture, media, and context. In one sense, a study of relationships between inner and outer space is about the relationship between interior and exterior spaces. But more profoundly, it is about the layering of temporalities, subjective, civic, technological, and historical. The viewer moves from the durational stillness of the gallery to the mundane clock time of the street, to the mythic time of the televised moon landing. This multi-scalar approach to time is characteristic of Lamelas' work. He refuses to treat time as either linear or homogeneous. Instead, his films often fracture time, loop it or hold it in suspension, prompting us to reflect not just on time as a theme, but on how time is structured in our own experience. This brings us to the Time as Activity series, a lifelong project that began in Dusseldorf in 1969. These works consist of fixed camera shots, typically 3 per film, recording the passage of time in a particular city. There is no voiceover, no plot, or no musical cue. What we see is time itself, people walking, clouds shifting, a tram passing, the sun falling across buildings. The camera does not tell us what to look at, it simply holds its gaze. Time as Activity Dusseldorf remains one of the most radical expressions of Lamelas' conceptual approach. The city is not presented as a symbol or character, but as a temporal condition. We see it in flux, yet held in suspension. But by denying the audience the usual markers of cinematic time, montage, suspense, or progression, Lamelas opens a space for attentiveness, a heightened awareness of the now. Each entry in the series reflects a particular moment in the artist's life, but the works are not autobiographical in any conventional sense. They offer a structure of presence, a way of being in time. Later installments, such as Time as Activity Buenos Aires from 2010, are inevitably more reflective, imbued with a sense of return and memory, but they remain formally consistent. Time is treated not as something to be narrated, but as something to be observed. Lamelas developed the idea of time as a shared construct further in his performance Time from 1970, first presented in Les Arcs in the French Alps. The premise was disarmingly simple. A group of participants passed the current time along a line, one person to each other, each repeating the phrase, "the time is," followed by the minute. When the time reached the end of the line, the final participant announced it to the world in a language of their choosing. This performance stripped away all material aspects of the artwork. There was no objects, no film, no documentation, only the repetition of a phrase spoken in rhythm with the clock. And yet what is achieved was profound, a communal awareness of time constructed through speech and interpersonal exchange. The structure was conceptual, but the experience was social, almost spiritual. Time exemplifies Lamelas' commitment to artworks that exist as both thought experiments and lived experience. It reminds us that time is not only measured, but shared, shaped by communication, repetition, and presence. Another film that we will see later today is Light at the Edge of a Nightmare, made between 2002 and 2005. It's a film noir constructed in episodic form, shot in 6 cities that trace Lamelas' own biography: Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, Berlin, London, Brussels, and Paris. In each sequence, the same narrative replays with subtle variations. A love affair between a man and a woman culminates in the man's death. The work is not linear, but recursive, staging the same emotional and narrative conditions across different spatial and cultural contexts. The film revisits Lamelas' long-standing interest in the architecture of narrative, as well as his fascination with eternal recurrence drawn from Borges. Actions repeat across geographies. Characters move through space that feels stylized and abstracted, more like sets or installation than real locations. In each episode, shifts in camera angle, light, and original music produce a temporal dislocation that resists straightforward chronology. Rather than offering psychological realism, the film constructs a kind of cinematic architecture, an effective space shaped by mood, memory, and fragmentation. The characters appear less as individuals than as figures within a system, returning, repeating, retracing. In this sense, the work is both a mediation on narrative and a reflection on the artist's own movements through cities, encounters, and images of the world. Time in Light at the Edge of a Nightmare is unstable. It contradicts and expands. It loops back on itself. The viewer experiences it as one might experience a reoccurring dream, recognizing shapes but unable to plot a timeline. The fragmentation reflects Lamelas' deeper concern, not just with how time is represented in cinema, but with how time is felt, how memory distorts it, how narrative seeks to fix it, and how the image can resist both. In this sense, the work connects to broader traditions in experimental cinema, but Lamelas' approach is distinctly his own, rooted in the conceptual rigor of art making, yet always sensitive to the ambiguities of experience. As we move towards the next section of my presentation, I invite you to reflect on your own perspective of time, not only in the works you'll see or have seen, but in the structure of this very talk, in the rhythms of the city outside, and in the interval between image and thought. For Lamelas, time is not a backdrop, but a co-creator. It shapes how we see, how we remember, and ultimately how we understand what it means to be present. This interrogation of place, its constructedness, its mediating function, finds one of its most layered expressions in The Desert People from 1974. made during Lamelas' time in Los Angeles. The film operates as both a conceptual investigation and a performance of cinematic authorship. Lamelas described it as a study of American movie making, shaped by his immersion in US culture and hours long spent watching television films late into the night. With no industry contacts at the time, he approached the film as both an outsider and an artist assuming the role of director, acting like a movie director and thus becoming a movie director, as he would later reflect. Structured in two parallel narrative strains, the film begins as a classic road movie, long, meditative shots of cars moving through the Sonoran desert with minimal dialogue and an emphasis on atmosphere over plot. The footage is intercut with 5 staged interviews with the characters John, an anthropologist, Carol, a college student, Chris, a journalist, Michael, a quiet observer, and Manny, a Papago Indian. They recount their experiences on a reservation. Their testimonies, however, resist narrative coherence. Some veer towards analysis, others towards cliché. None seem entirely trustworthy. The effect is deliberately disorientating. What appears at first to be a conventional documentary structured gradually begins to unravel. The interviews are delivered with measured, almost theatrical detachment, as if the speakers are aware they are performing for the camera. Manny's speech in particular reveals the layered complexities of language and identity. He begins in English, shifts into Spanish, and finally into Papago, underscoring not only the loss of cultural specificity, but also the failure of representation itself. In this sense, the film becomes a mediation on incommunicability, on what cannot be captured or translated by documentary form. I have a small clip here, which we can watch just for a few minutes.
The women, in general, I found to be so open to my probes and my questions. I was a little hesitant when we first got there because I knew that the Indians were reticent people, that they didn't indulge in small talk, and felt that they might really resent this white Eastern woman coming in and asking them how they live their lives. Maybe it was because I started off with Mary Grace and she is held in such high esteem by her people that the women accepted me, and as the weeks went on they grew more and more and more eager to talk. As a matter of fact, they seemed to vie for my attention and to get me to come and stay with them. They would come up to me and say, "You come stay with me next week, we'll have sweets." Sweets are a big status symbol among the tribe, and they were offering me sweets to come and stay with them. It was just remarkable. The third week I was there, I stayed with a young family, and this family is kind of an example of what's going on with the younger people today. The woman, Elena, is 22 years old. She has a little baby, 1 year old. She's working as a beautician's assistant just while her husband finishes nursing school. And when he's done, she quits working. She's going to stay home and have more children, and her husband is going to take care of her. The 4th and 5th weeks that I was there, I lived with 2 of the most exciting old women of the tribe. One is Rafaela, who is a tribal judge. She's not a lawyer, she's not even a college or high school graduate, but she's looked upon by her people as a very fair, wise, just woman, and she was elected at a popular election to become a judge. And even though it is a tribal election, she's sanctioned, or whatever you call it, by the government. She's a real judge. The 5th week I was there, I lived with Juanita, the medicine lady. Not only did I not expect to find even medicine men, but I certainly didn't expect to find medicine lady. That she is nowhere near my stereotype notion of what a medicine man is like. She's a very soft-spoken, combination shrink, midwife, and GP. She has rates. She says.
Okay, this sense of estrangement culminates in the film's final moments when the road movie strand of the film ends not in arrival or revelation, but in sudden violence. The car crashes off a cliff. The moment is jarring and unresolved. It breaks the film's quiet rhythm, but offers no interpretative closure. As with much of Lamelas' work, we are left with rupture, ambiguity, and the awareness of the image can no longer be trusted to explain what it shows. The Desert People is not a critique of ethnographic representation in the conventional sense. It's not primarily concerned with the portrayal of indigenous culture, which remains largely off-screen, but a self-conscious performance of filmmaking itself. Lamelas uses the apparatus of cinema to examine its own codes, its borrowed genres, and its implicit claims to authority. Place here is not a subject to be captured, but a setting through which performance, projection, and displacement unfold. The film also marks a shift in Lamelas' practice towards narrative structure, not to embrace it, but to dissect it. His use of genre, road movie, documentary, confession, is not only about homage or pastiche, but about exposing their fragility. The film's strength lies in its refusal to resolve. It withholds identification, continuity, and mastery, asking us instead to sit with its disjunctions. This approach to place, as mediated, unstable, and politically loaded, echoes across many of Lamelas' films, though it's rendered more introspectively in recent works, most notably in This Is My Place from 23, which we saw on Saturday, sorry. Here, Lamelas returns to the city of Los Angeles, not to critique its representation of others, but to reflect on how it shaped his own identity. Structured as a conversation between Lamelas and the curator Carla Acevedo Yates, the film moves through various neighborhoods, a past studio, and sites of memory. The premise is deceptively simple. Lamelas revisits places significant to his career, narrating anecdotes and reflecting on his past. But beneath the surface, This Is My Place is a study of place as a scaffold for memory, how cities become repositories of affect, ambition, and loss. In contrast to the desert's blankness, Los Angeles in this film is dense with associations. It's a city where Lamelas produced The Desert People, where he collaborated with Hildegard Duane, and where the cultural mythology of Hollywood becomes a site for artistic self-invention. He moves through the city like a figure in his own fiction, retracing his steps without nostalgia, narrating his history with a tone that oscillates between irony and sincerity. What's striking about This Is My Place is the way it dramatizes the relationship between geography and persona. Lamelas is not playing himself so much as performing the artist, a role he consciously inhabits throughout the film. In this sense, place becomes a stage for identity, and the film becomes a mediation on the act of returning to cities, to artworks, and to self-representations formed over time. In This Is My Place, the site is both literal, Los Angeles, and metaphorical, the memory space of an artist reflecting on his trajectory. The city is not merely shown, it is activated through language and narrative. This mode of working with place as a conceptual field extends to Lamelas' broader body of work. His Time as Activities series, while centered on time, also foregrounds the specificity of place. Each city, Dusseldorf, Rome, Buenos Aires, is captured through its own temporality. Formal consistency of the series belies the variation of atmosphere and movement, inviting the viewer to compare how cities breathe differently, how they age, and how they speak without speaking. But while earlier in this lecture we considered time as activity as a durational framework, it's worth briefly noting how the series also marks Lamelas' own mobility, his shifting residence, his movement through European and American art scenes. his personality as a transnational artist. His work does not belong to a single geography. It unfolds across a network of places that are always in tension with one another. Buenos Aires and London, Paris and Los Angeles, the exhibition space and the city outside. Place in this sense is never merely a backdrop. It's a lens through which identity, history and meaning are produced. And in Lamelas' work, it's always entangled with media. Whether critiquing the colonial gaze in The Desert People or restaging his biography in This Is My Place, Lamelas insists that places are not just inhabited, they are performed, remembered and contested. As we move to the next section of the presentation, which focuses on film form, it becomes clear that these investigations of place, like those of time, are inseparable from the medium through which they are expressed. Lamelas does not treat form as a container, but as an active agent in shaping the content and the meaning of his work. In the next section, we'll explore how he manipulates the structure of film itself to question authorship, narrative, and the mechanisms of media. Throughout his career, David Lamelas has treated film not as a vessel for content, but as a conceptual apparatus. He uses film not to narrate stories in a traditional sense, but to interrogate the systems through which meaning is constructed, mediated, and performed. His approach is analytical, often ironic, disassembling cinematic conventions, questioning media formats, and staging the performativity of power. In The Dictator, from 1976, which we'll see later today, which he made shortly after relocating to Los Angeles, Lamelas assumes the persona of Colonel Ricardo Garcia Perez, a fictional former president of the island of Santa Ana, now living in exile. The film takes the form of a television interview. Perez is questioned by a news anchor, played by Hildegard Twain, on a stark studio set designed to resemble a current affairs program. Over the course of the dialogue, he defends his regime, speculates on the suspicious deaths of his wives, and outlines his plans to return to power. The content is outrageous, yet delivered with total conviction. The performance is persuasive, the set convincing. Lamelas and Duane aren't just satirizing rhetoric, they're dissecting the medium that gives rhetoric its force. The Dictator collapses the distinction between reportage and fiction, spectacle and control. It shows how televisual language, framing, tone, lighting can construct credibility. The viewer becomes complicit in the spectacle of power. But the work is not simply parody, it's a study in performance, of authority, charisma, delusion, and in how media enables such performances to circulate as truth. It anticipates debates around political spectacle, image management, and the aesthetics of authoritarianism. Yet Lamelas offers no didactic commentary. His critique emerges from the structure itself, from the exposure of form as fiction. 15 years later, Lamelas and Duane returned to this terrain with Smart People from 1991. Again, another film we'll see later today. The film's a short black and white video shot on the streets of Los Angeles. Two characters, a man and a woman, stand beside a shopping trolley filled with belongings. They are exiled, reduced, displaced. The woman speaks at length about their former lives of status and importance. The man stands mostly silent. There is no plot, no resolution, just fragments of memory, fragments of performance. The identities of the characters remain ambiguous, but their connection to the Dictator is unmistakable. Smart People is not a sequel, but a shadow. It shows the aftermath of performance, the afterlife of power, where the Dictator constructs a persona through the mechanisms of television. Smart People exposes what happens when those mechanisms vanish. The film is laced with irony, but also with melancholy. The woman's recollections border on delusion, yet she clings to them as a form of selfhood. The use of black and white heightens the sense of detachment, decay, and historical ambiguity. The title, Smart People, reads as a bitter joke. These are not characters seeking redemption or clarity. They are voices caught in a loop of narration long after their audience has disappeared. Together, the dictator and smart people form a kind of diptych. One shows the construction of power through media, the other its quiet unraveling. But Smart People is not simply a postscript. It's a part of a wider sequence of works made in collaboration with Hildegard Duane that includes The Dictator Returns from 1984, where Colonel Perez reappears older but no less deluded, still rehearsing his myth of control. Across these films, Lamelas and Duane build a sustained body of work exploring the spectacle of power, its performance through media, and its inevitable decline. Smart People is not a sequel to The Dictator, but it echoes its concerns from a different vantage, one in which power has collapsed and the characters are left to repeat their roles long after the stage has disappeared. Their collaborations across the 1970s and 80s constitute a sustained examination of the spectacle of power, the codes of media, and the instability of identity, whether through mock interviews, fictionalized broadcasts, or street corner monologues. These films do not seek to represent reality, but interrogate the forms that claim to deliver it. Lamelas' use of film form is not didactic, but structural. He stages scenes to expose the machinery behind them, inviting the viewer to recognize fiction where authority is performed. His cinema offers no closure, only reflection, dissonance, and a quiet dismantling of belief. We might consider this alongside earlier works like Film Script, Manipulation of Meaning from 1972, which is a conceptual film that consisted of still images, intertitles, and a narrated voiceover. In that piece, Lamelas explored how sequencing, editing, and linguistic cues shape the interpretation of images. By removing the illusion of continuity, he invited the viewer to witness the construction of meaning in real time. Each juxtaposition, each shift in tone or image produced a new context, revealing the malleability of narrative and the ease with which it can be restructured. All of these works shape a common principle. Form is never neutral. The structure of film, its rhythm, editing, and framing and delivery is ideologically charged as its content. Lamelas' genius lies in his ability to reveal this without resorting to dogma or overstatement. His critiques are embedded in the work itself. They unfold slowly, often ambivalently, requiring the viewer to think reflexively, to question the assumptions about what constitutes a reliable image or a legitimate voice. Returning to The Dictator, we can also understand the film in relation to Lamelas' larger practice of constructing personas. Just as is in This Is My Place explores the figure of the artist as a narrative device, The Dictator offers the politician as a cultural fiction, a role that is rehearsed, broadcast, and consumed. In both cases, Lamelas explores the aesthetic conditions of credibility, what makes someone believe, and how form determines our willingness to believe. Lamelas once said The Dictator was also in part a response to his experience of exile, to his awareness of political language when filtered through media becomes theatrical. This resonates with his earlier concerns in Office of Information about the Vietnam War from 1968, but here it's refracted through fiction, humor, and impersonation. As a filmmaker, Lamelas positions himself within his work, but never straightforwardly. He is both subject and observer, performer and analyst. He engages with film form, his engagement with film form is not just about breaking conventions, but about recontextualizing them, showing how the smallest gesture, a camera angle, a phrase, a pause, can shift the ideological meaning of a scene. This approach places him in dialogue with the broader tradition of structural film and expanded cinema alongside filmmakers such as Hollis Frampton, Chantal Ackerman or Haroon Farooqi. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Lamelas never abandons the possibility of narrative or the pleasure of performance. His work is always grounded in an awareness of audience, of how media circulates, how it is received, and how it shapes public consciousness. In recent years, this self-reflexive approach has only deepened. This Is My Place, for example, uses film form as an advice to question autobiography itself. It weaves archival material with present-day conversations, reenactments, and staged reflections. The editing is elliptical, the narrative is loose. Lamelas plays himself but also performs himself, conspicuously shaping his legacy even as he recounts it. The film becomes both a portrait and a construction, a mediation on how we narrate our lives through image and how those images in turn define who we are. To summarize, Lamelas uses film not simply to tell stories, but to reveal how stories are constructed, how images, sounds, and structures shape our perceptions of truth, authority, and identity. His work dismantles cinematic conventions in order to expose their ideological weight. At every turn, he asks us to examine not just what we see, but how and why we see it. In this, his work sits within a broader tradition of conceptual and structural film, yet it remains distinctive in its sensitivity to audience, to humor, and to the complexities of self-representation. Lamelas doesn't reject narrative outright, he reframes it, using performance displacement and formal intervention to explore its limits and possibilities. What endures across his practice is a commitment to openness, an art that resists prescription and invites reflection, whether staging political personas, constructing fictional interviews, or quietly observing a city street. Lamelas reminds us that form is never neutral, and that our understanding of time, place, and power is always mediated. His film asks us to stay alert, to watch slowly, to think critically, and remain open to uncertainty. As we come to the end of this presentation, I want to return to a question that has quietly underpinned our discussion. What does it mean to make a work that is open? Over the past hour, we've explored how David Lamelas has engaged with time not as a fixed dimension, but as a lived and constructed experience. How he has approached place not as a neutral geography, but as a contested and mutable field. And how he has used film form not merely to represent, but to challenge the ways meaning is produced and power is performed. These are not isolated inquiries, they are interwoven strands of a practice that refuses simplification. Lamelas does not work in styles or periods. He works in questions, returning to them, reframing them, and testing how they behave under different conditions. The result is a body of work that feels remarkably consistent in its conceptual clarity, yet continually surprising in its formal strategies. What distinguishes his approach is not only intelligence, but its restraint. There is no didacticism here, no desire to instruct or conclude. His films, performances, and installations are structured to allow space for thought, for contradiction, for ambiguity. They resist closure and reward attentiveness. The work in the program that we've seen on Saturday and will see later today reflects this ethos in different ways. This Is My Place is an intimate reflection, but not confessional. The Dictator is theatrical and absurd, but never merely comic. Smart People is humorous, yet critical, and Time as activity. The simplest gesture, a fixed camera on a street, becomes a mediation on presence, absence, and the rhythm of the everyday. What we encounter across these works is not a singular statement, but a method of inquiry. Lamelas uses film not as a window onto the world, but as a system that mirrors its complexity, capable of holding together history, memory, fiction, ideology, and doubt. In doing so, he encourages encourages us to consider not just what we are watching, but how and why we are watching it. This, I think, is the enduring value of his practice. It asks us to slow down, to pay attention, and to reflect on the structures, temporal, spatial, narrative, that govern our perception of reality. At a time when images circulate at unprecedented speed, when meaning is constantly being flattened and polarized, Lamelas offers us something different, a cinema of thought. He once said, "We may come from different cultures, be of different color or religion, but we all share one single time of the present." This statement, simple on its surface, encapsulates much of what I have hoped to explore today, that time, shared, unfolding, and fragile, is the condition in which we think, relate, and create. That place, inhabited or remembered, shapes who we are, and that film in the right hands can make these invisible structures visible. Lamelas' work is an ongoing conversation. As we engage in these films and with the questions they raise, we're not just looking back, we're also looking forward, because the questions Lamelas asks are not only about art, they are about how we live, how we relate, and how we construct the realities in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
Vamos a empezar con algunas preguntas, primero de acá de la sala, y después vamos a pasar a preguntas virtuales de las más de 30 personas que están escuchando por Zoom. ¿Alguien acá en la habitación que quiera hacer alguna pregunta? Sí. Si lo vas a hacer en inglés, te pido que hagas en inglés o en español, digo en ambos idiomas, si no, hacela en español y yo se la traduzco a Steven, como prefieras.
Dale, en español iré. ¿Qué fue lo que te atrajo del trabajo, de la obra de David Lamelas, y por qué dedicaste, digamos, tu vida realmente a la obra de Lamelas?
He asked, what was that you were drawn to in Lamelas' work? Why have you decided to dedicate a good part of your life in studying his work?
I'll be honest. When I first encountered his work, it confused me. I questioned what it was and what it was doing, and as I kind of engaged more with his practice and looked at more of his work, this idea of there being an underlying logic across different forms started to make more sense. As a brief response, could you remember the full question?
What you were drawn to in Lamelas' work, and why have you decided to spend a big part of your life? Yeah.
And another reason is the very subtle humor in the work. I find really endearing, and that humor runs throughout his practice from the very beginning to today in the films and work that he's making now. And as I've got to know him more as a person and understand how his personhood relates to his work, that endearing quality has only been accentuated.
Bien, ¿alguna otra pregunta de la sala?
Hola, quería saber cómo dialoga la obra de Lamelas con otros artistas internacionales de su época.
She is wondering how Lamelas' work dialogues with the work of other international artists of that time.
In the 60s and 70s, his work has a very close relationship to conceptual art in Britain. In later works, the works that he made in Los Angeles, there is a very close relationship to video art that was made on the West Coast at that time. his work circulates in different circles and different periods of his work is studied academically for different reasons. So conceptually, the earlier period is perhaps more of a focus. But the actual fact of him traveling so much has meant that he, along with his work, has traveled with it, and he's engaged with many scenes. And in some ways his work deliberately engages with the scenes in which he finds himself, particularly with the films like the Time as Activity series, which he's made in a lot of countries, or Light at the Edge of a Nightmare, where he's making episodic, he's made an episodic work in different locations. So in all of the locations that he finds himself, his persona as an artist is very much embedded, and these are kind of some of the ways his work has circulated. I don't know if that's a very clear response.
¿Alguna otra pregunta de acá de la sala? Si no, empezamos con las preguntas acá. ¿Quieres pasar?
Yo tengo una pregunta, pero en realidad por ahí es un comentario para pensar algunas cuestiones en relación a los films de David, incluso su obra no fílmica. Vos has reparado bastante en cuestiones que tienen que ver con el humor, la ironía, y usualmente lo pensamos a David en esa situación de artista internacional que está moviéndose por diferentes países y diferentes culturas, pero quizás ahora, con tu estadía aquí en Buenos Aires, conociendo un poco su lugar de origen, hay algo del humor, hay algo de la ironía que forma parte de nuestro ADN, ¿no? Argentino, que se coló de diferentes formas en sus películas. ¿Qué opinas al respecto o qué nos puedes decir?
So he says it's more of a comment maybe than a question, and based on your experience here. So we know that David works with humor and irony in his practice, as you've been showing in different examples of his work. What Francisco wanted to ask you perhaps is, since you were here in Buenos Aires, we have known Lamelas as an international figure, more this international artist. But now that you've been here physically in Buenos Aires, getting to know that it's actually kind of part of our Argentinian DNA to have this irony and humor within us, how do you feel this translates to his practice, now that you have this point of view?
Well, I definitely identify with that connection, and I identify that connection with David as a person. I think I don't know if it's influenced my thinking on his work, because I know him so well. If I didn't, it might, and the experience of being here might influence that. But I do really feel a connection with Buenos Aires as a city, and I think that shared humor is a connection and part of that.
So I'm going to go with one of the virtual. Does anybody have another question? ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta en el cuarto? Me quedo. ¿Alguien más por acá en la habitación? Listo.
Hola. Está prendido. Yo no sé si él habló con David Lamelas sobre esto, pero si él sabe cuán cinéfilo es David y su relación con, podríamos decir, con el cine como experimental, comercial de la época, como el free cinema en Inglaterra, o la Nouvelle Vague, o las experiencias más experimentales de Los Ángeles. Si él sabe un poco cuál es la relación de David con ese tipo de cine.
So he wonders whether you know David is a cinephile or not, if he's a film lover outside of his practice, and what relationship he might have had or he has with experimental films from that time, whether it is free cinema in England or more experimental movies in Los Angeles, but more on the commercial side of film.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I don't know. It's not something generally don't. It's not a conversation we've had. I think when an artist works so closely to the proximity of other more commercial forms, it's not really a question that I ask too much, because it's almost a given that there is an awareness of all of these things. And relationship between free cinema in Britain, I think perhaps, but I think also the relationship between inner and outer space is so far removed from those films, which is like experimental documentary of the time. It really is on its own, and I know a bit about free cinema in the UK, in Britain during that period, and for me this film is like perhaps even an interrogation of that, or just by chance completely coincidental that it's an amazing work of its own independence.
Porque él en la película que vimos el sábado habla un poco sobre todo habla del punk, y habla y su entrevista a Marguerite Duras de alguna manera la ubica, digamos, dentro, o lo ubica él dentro de esta relación con la Nouvelle Vague, pero quería saber si él había hablado con David Lamelas sobre esto.
So he says that so in the film we saw on Saturday, we saw David mentioning the punk scene in Los Angeles, and also his interview to punk scene in London, and his interview to Marie Duran. So we can assume there is this tie with experimental film, but he was wondering if you actually had discussed this in depth, or.
We've discussed the artists that David has known and has worked alongside, but never in relation to their. It's always been about their relationship as artists and their relationship person to person, rather than practice and the detail of practice. So I don't know if I can reveal anything there.
¿Alguna otra pregunta acá del auditorio? Bueno, entonces paso a una de las preguntas virtuales que tenemos. I'm going to go with the virtual questions. En español dice, ¿qué pasó en estos años que los artistas empezaron a hacer este tipo de obra en épocas como el nacimiento del videoarte? So it is, what happened in these years that artists began to do these types of works in times of the birth of video art, for example?
Sorry, I'm writing this down. This is my tactic now, so I don't forget. Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Sorry, my
no,
brain
it's okay.
is switching between languages and I can't quite.
What happened in these years that artists began to make these types of new works, such as video art?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the relationship between maybe David's films and the birth of video art?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for David, but the film The Desert People was shot on 16mm and was, 16mm is incredibly expensive even at the time way of producing film. And the advent of video meant that formats could be explored more freely, which there is many films from that period all on video, and I think with David's work and also his collaborations with Hildegard Duane, the format of video allowed for a quicker, faster exploration of ideas that didn't require as much development as, say, The Desert People is a 45-minute film, almost a feature film. And that also goes hand in hand with the development of media of the time and the dissemination of news and the way information was received. So from perhaps an earlier period, information was received through quite limited sources, through television and radio across a small range of channels, to later period in the 80s and 90s where the proliferation of media and news and 24-hour news all become much more energetic, and in some ways the advent of video and the work of video artists, particularly the artists that were making works like David and Hildegard, were able to realize more of their ideas more easily.
Okay, let me check. Okay, one final question. Una última pregunta, que esto es más de mi parte. Quería que hables un poquito sobre la relación entre David y Hildegard y cómo fue esa proliferación de nuevas obras más cortas en su práctica en Los Ángeles. Just wanted a brief comment on David's relationship with Hildegard, how that began and how that kind of like flourished in a lot of different works in Los Angeles at that time.
Yeah, so again, I don't really want to speak about David's biography without him here to correct me, but so David and Hildegard met in Los Angeles and were both orbiting around an organization that was really pioneering video art in Los Angeles and was one of the places where that production of work was really supported. So they met there, they collaborated on several works. Hildegard also had her independent practice and was making videos of her own at that time. So their practices were kind of operating in parallel in Los Angeles over a long, long time. And at the same time as making works independently, were also collaborating together. When they collaborated, they often revisited ideas or even revisited characters in the work. So there was always a return to common ideas or common shared storylines that they had generated together, or maybe one had a stronger idea in one instance and the other collaborated, or vice versa. And I think their collaborations are incredibly interesting because they're sustained over such a long period of time, and they are two artists that are in contact to this day and do correspond to this day. I don't know the exact date of their last collaboration, but yeah, their meeting was through Los Angeles and being on the periphery of Hollywood. Hildegard also had an association working with Hollywood and working in Hollywood, so there was a connection there as well.
Okay, super. I believe we have no further questions. No tenemos más preguntas. Tenemos una pregunta más, perfecto. ¿Quieres? One more.
Gracias. Perdón, recién termino de formularla. Bueno, noté que hay una cuestión común entre la arquitectura y el cine. La arquitectura trabaja sobre la percepción del espacio a través del movimiento y el cine registra la experiencia del tiempo en el espacio.
She says she noticed that there's a relationship between architecture and film. Architecture works in the perception of space, and film.
Perdón. No, es que como estoy escuchando la traducción, perdón. Sí, decía que la arquitectura registra la percepción del tiempo a través del movimiento en el espacio.
Architecture registers the perception of movement through time and space.
Del tiempo a través del movimiento en el espacio. ¿Sí? Y el cine registra la experiencia del tiempo en el espacio.
And movement register the experience of time in space.
Entonces, lo que quería saber era en qué medida y cómo afectó la obra de Lamelas en su propia conceptualización del tiempo y el espacio. No, en qué medida la obra de Lamelas afecta su propia conceptualización del tiempo.
In what measure does Lamelas' work alter your perception of time and space?
My own. I think the questions that his work raises, from the more media critical works to the more conceptual works, and maybe the works specifically that relate to time. Being in proximity to these works and maybe revisiting them has heightened my awareness at that particular moment. It's not something that has shifted my perception of time, but for the moment in which I'm considering or experiencing the work, that element is sharpened, and I think that would be true for all of us, that in considering the works and thinking about the works as we've talked today, and then seeing time as activity later today, we will become a bit more aware of all of these aspects, but then it's very easy to go back into the everyday and to be caught again in the stream of daily perceptions of time, which are not as enjoyable often.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, can I say a thank you to everyone that's joined this morning, to CROA, to the British Council. David will be here later as well, so I do hope that you stick around for the films. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
Ahora vamos a hacer un break de almuerzo de 1 hora y media. Nos volvemos a encontrar acá a las 2:15. La siguiente sección va a ser ver esta selección de películas que mencionó Steven. Después vamos a hacer una pausa y después vamos a terminar con una entrevista pública de Steven a David Lamelas, que va a estar acá presente. Pero tenemos 1 hora y media de descanso por almuerzo.